All right. Well, I'll introduce myself again because I think that I'm really important. I'm Officer Jessica Nahr. I'm the Refugee Liaison Officer for the Boise Police Department. We're really glad to have you guys all here today. I'm really fortunate to have partners from our other surrounding agencies in the Valley here as well to help with this presentation today, because you guys are going to hear me talk probably more than you'd like to. So I'm going to turn it over to them, let them introduce themselves, and we'll get started.
So I am Deputy Amanda Levis. I prefer being called Mandy unless I'm in trouble. I work for the Ada County Sheriff's Office. I actually started in dispatch and I did work with Hank. And then I moved to the jail and now I am a patrol deputy. I'm gonna pass it off to you.
All right, my name's Justin Mann. I work with the Garden City Police Department. I started there about 5 years ago this year. I worked on patrol for a while, and now I'm on our traffic enforcement team, and I do some other stuff here and there. Before that, I got a military background, and then I did work in the Canyon County Jail for about a year.
Good morning. My name is Officer Ashley Horvath. I am from the Meridian Police Department. Started my law enforcement career back in 2012. Made the move to Meridian in 2017. Started in patrol and am now currently assigned to our crisis intervention team.
You good? Can it go to the map? So I'm assuming, common knowledge, people don't know that there's differences between police departments, sheriff's offices, things like that. So they're all called officers because they work for city police departments, and I'm called a deputy because I work for the sheriff's office. So there's actually on your tables, I saw when I was sitting down, there's a rolled up map. If you guys want to look at that, you can see on the map, it's color coded and it will show you what areas I work. I work all of the unincorporated Ada County, not just by myself, there's a ton of us. Officer Mann works Garden City, I believe it's green. Horvath works Meridian, and then Jessica obviously works for Boise City. So those different jurisdictions are where we have our authority. And then Ada County also, we are in charge of anything civil. So it's kind of, now I have the map up here. And then Ada County, we also have a contract with the cities of Kuna, Star, and Eagle. So they can be called officers if you want, but they are sheriff's office employees. And next. Is it you or Horvath?
So Garden City Police Department, obviously we serve the city of Garden City. We have about 12,000 plus residents. What's kind of unique about Garden City is the fact that it's actually in the middle of Boise and it's surrounded by Boise. So a lot of confusion that comes up in our daily business is, well, does Garden City Police need to help me, or is it Boise Police that needs to help me? So that's kind of one of the things where we rely on our Ada County dispatch to really help us out with that. With us being our own city, obviously, we have our own set of codes, regulations, and everything else that goes along with being a city.
So Meridian Police Department's going to be similar. We're responsible for responding to calls for service within city limits. Meridian is a quickly and rapidly growing city. It is currently 36 square miles, and our population is at 119,000 people, with more people moving to our city each and every day. Similar to Garden City, and like Boise, we have our own set of city codes and ordinances. So there are some differences on maybe how we'll respond to calls for service, which we'll talk about here in a little bit.
Yeah, and the same thing. So Boise, we respond to calls that either occur in the city limits or involve our residents. So we felt like it was really important to include jurisdiction, because I often run into that people just don't understand who's supposed to respond or who they should call, or maybe they lived somewhere different before and the police responded a certain way to a certain type of call or request, and then it was different. And that could be because of different city codes, ordinances, or laws that are actually unique to that jurisdiction. So we're gonna talk about that a little bit as we go through our presentation today. And hopefully this will make a little more sense to all of you, and then you can spread that knowledge all that you interact with throughout the day.
All right, so who to call and when to call? It's kind of the big question. What we want everybody to know is that if you think you need to call the police, or maybe you don't know if the police can even help you, we want you to call Ada County Dispatch. The police department, the sheriff's office, we're a jack of all trades. We can help with everything. And if we can't help you with something, we're going to direct you in the right place where you can solve your problems or maybe just get you something extra to help you out. With that being said, obviously we talked to, the Ada County Dispatch talked to us previously. So you can use 911 or you can use the non-emergency. So with the 911, just make sure if you're using that, it's a life-threatening situation, any in-progress crimes, just calls like that, use the 911 for that. The non-emergency, really try to use that for everything else that's not life-threatening. Nobody's in danger of being harmed. If your vehicle was burglarized over the night and you just walked out and found it was broke into, that's a good thing to use the non-emergency for. And most importantly, when we go back to talking about jurisdiction, when you don't have to know which police department needs to come out, whether it be Ada County, Boise, Garden City, when you give your information to the Ada County dispatchers, they're going to ask you a series of questions that, one, helps figure out what's happening, what your problem is. They're going to ask you where you are, and then also where the crime occurred. So based on your location and where the crime occurred, that'll help dictate which police department's going to come out and help you. So that's an important thing to remember, okay?
So, like Officer Mann said, the hard work's done for you. You answer the questions. Dispatch will send the appropriate officers for that jurisdiction. And honestly, if we show up as Boise Police Department and it's not us, we'll talk with you, and then we'll put that call back in holding and then communicate with the correct agency, and then they'll come out and handle that as well. So it's not something you need to think about overly much, but it is something that is just good to know. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that as well, or have hesitations about calling because they don't know which department that they want. So the next piece we want to talk about is language access, because this is important, right? A lot of you work with people who either are limited English proficient, or you know people that do, and those are some burning questions, like, do people have to pay for interpretation services? Are interpretation services available? What type are available? At what situations are they going to be provided? So for law enforcement officers in the Ada County area, all of us do things very similarly. Every agency has access to language line solutions, and every agency has access to the interpretation services from contract interpreters that are hired, vetted, and trained by the Boise Police Department. Every agency in the Valley can use those same interpreters to provide either in-person or telephonic interpretation as well. So we will provide interpretation services if we know it's needed. So there's a few things that we kind of follow the guidelines from the DOJ on that. So if somebody doesn't speak English, that's obvious, right? We're gonna have to use an interpreter to communicate with them. If they say they want an interpreter, even if they are speaking English fairly well, but they ask for an interpreter, we will provide one. And then sometimes this happens as well. Somebody speaks English fairly well, but they have a kind of a limited vocabulary or a limited grasp of the language. So the officer's talking to them, and as they tell their story, the officer's like, okay, I understand all of that, but then the officer starts asking follow-up questions. And then they're not getting answers that jive with the question they have. So at that point, like, we're training our officers to realize, okay, I could understand them, but just because somebody can speak a language well doesn't mean they understand it as well. Or maybe their vocabulary is limited to the point they can't understand those questions. So that's a point where then an officer would get an interpreter, either telephonically or in person, to complete that investigation. So this is something that we're gonna do while we're performing our duties as a police officer. There's been a few situations where maybe we're doing more of a community caretaking function, or just doing something like doing somebody a favor, where interpretation services aren't offered when it wasn't necessary to communicate, like maybe giving somebody a ride in a situation like that. And that they won't necessarily always provide interpretation when they're not performing their duties as a police officer. But for the most part, we're going to, because we want to communicate with our community. And we do want to make sure that we understand what's actually happening and what did happen. So what about informal interpreters? What about friends, family members, kids, right? So again, we follow the DOJ recommendations on those. So we shouldn't be using those unless it's exigent circumstances. And it's really tempting to officers when we show up on scene and we didn't know somebody doesn't speak English well, and then maybe a kid runs up that speaks English and their primary language, and they want to help us out. Okay, it's really tempting. We train on this a lot. Even if they do use kids or informal interpreters, there's a lot of reasons why we shouldn't use those, which those of you who work with LEP populations understand, but we're training on it all the time, and even if they do, they're trained to get an interpreter and then make sure they cover all that ground again. So not just rely on that informal interpreter and their perspective. And there's a lot of reasons why we're doing that, but we really want to make sure we understand what's going on there. So hopefully that kind of answers some of your questions about that. And it's always good, like if we know there's a language barrier when they call dispatch and we know the language, we can be more prepared to handle that. But sometimes they can speak English well enough to communicate with dispatch, but then we show up and we're like, this isn't gonna work. Or somebody speaks English fairly well, but they're in crisis. And under stress, some of that language ability kind of leaves the station. And they're not able to express themselves well. So even if you speak English fairly well where officers don't need an interpreter, if somebody wants one and requests one, that will be provided for them.
What to expect when officers arrive. So depending on the call that we get is gonna depend on our response. So I'm not gonna go too into depth with it, but there's code 1, code 2, and code 3 responses. Code 1's like the lowest level. There's zero emergency. There's no chance of anyone getting hurt, like report calls or things like that. Priority 2 is we need to bump it up a little bit. There could be potential for someone to get hurt. And priority 3 is we need to get there now. Someone's in danger. So what to expect when we arrive. Most of the time, we're gonna handle all of our calls the same. Like we'll come in, we'll separate parties, we'll do our investigation. Oh, I'm losing track of where I was at. Sorry. So whether you called the police, someone else called the police on you, which happens quite often, or you're being accused of committing a crime, we just want you to understand the basics of how you're gonna help us to help you. So we're gonna go over a few, or I guess one of our calls that we get pretty often. It's a noise complaint. So if somebody calls in a noise complaint on you, the way that we're gonna respond is probably gonna be a one officer response. We're gonna come out there, we're gonna see if there is a noise. We'll probably just knock on your door, calmly ask for whoever lives there, the homeowner, and ask you to turn whatever the noise is down. That's the simplest way to handle that call. If we get there and there's this huge raging party going on, we're probably not gonna handle that with just one deputy or officer. We're gonna want more people there to help us. Because keep in mind, everything that we do is for our safety as well as your safety. So I know I've seen it on all sorts of platforms where people are like, why is there so many cops here? What do you guys need so many cops here? It's not because we think you're the biggest criminal in the world. It's just basically for our safety, to make us feel more safe. But back to the noise complaint. If someone called the noise complaint on you, we'll ask you to turn it down. If you are the calling party on a noise complaint, dispatch will ask you if you want to sign a complaint. So basically what signing the complaint means is that you're willing to say, hey, yes, I called the cops on you, and I'm gonna go to court and I'm gonna testify as to why you were making so much noise and I'm citing you with a misdemeanor citation. So that's kind of confusing, and the court system will probably go further in depth into it. But again, noise complaints, they're very low level. It probably won't be handled right away, depending on what else is going on in our areas, because it's a priority 1 call. So I know to somebody calling in, it might be the biggest burden in the world that your neighbor's making too much noise. But for us, that's pretty low level compared to, like a domestic or a fight or something like that. And I think we all basically handle calls the same, but in our areas, there's gonna be different consequences for a noise complaint, because we all have different codes and different ordinances.
Okay, so just a caveat off of what Deputy Levis was saying. So all our different departments are going to have different protocols. In Garden City, obviously a noise complaint is a lower level, like she discussed, priority 1 call. So it's something we're going to get to in a timely manner, but if there's higher priority calls that are priority 2, or like batteries in progress and stuff like that, we're going to handle those first. Just the caveat off of the Ada County Dispatch Center presentation as well, it's important for us that you stay on the line and talk to the dispatch. Make sure and give them as much information as you can, names, phone numbers, and information like that. Because in Garden City, for example, we can always use the state code for disorderly conduct, but also we have a city code. But that code has specific elements that have to be met in order for that to work. So for that to work in Garden City, we had to be able to talk to the calling party and who the complainant is. And then on top of that, there has to be a second complainant in a different household that is willing to sign a complaint as well. Okay, so that's why it becomes important that we give all the information out and that we can actually contact you before we get out there to figure out exactly what we need to do.
So Meridian City is going to be similar in our response as Ada County as well as Garden City. It's just considered a lower level crime. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean anything to us. It's still important. It's still something we want to take care of. It's still something where we want our community to know that we care and we don't want your peace to be disturbed. In the city of Meridian, we have a couple different options, but the biggest two that we'll see is in the city of Meridian, we have a code or an ordinance between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. It's kind of like our quiet hours. If someone were to call in and is willing to be a signing party for a noise complaint, a citation can be issued in that sense. But we can also use disturbing the peace any time of the day or night. But again, in just kind of mirroring what they have to say, in order for us to take any type of enforcement, in other words, issuing a citation, we have to have somebody who's willing to sign the complaint. If you call dispatch and you don't want your neighbors to know it's you, that's your right, and you can be an anonymous calling party. Just understand that our options as police officers is going to be limited in our response. If we don't have a signing party, our peace cannot be disturbed. So more than likely, we're going to go to that house. We're still going to make contact with the occupants of that house, and we're going to ask them to, hey, can you quiet it down? This is the complaint that we have received.
Yeah, so there's a lot of similarity here, but there are different codes and ordinances for each jurisdiction. Like, we don't have quiet hours in Boise. And some people move in from other places and they're like, it's after 10 and they're being loud. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, but it's after 10. And I'm like, okay. Oh, you think that there's a rule about the time. So there has to be that malicious intent for disturbing the peace, which is the code we use most often for noise complaints. And that malicious intent just means somebody knows they were bothering you and then they continued. You go knock on your neighbor's door, say, hey, your music's really loud, will you turn it down? And they're like, yeah, sure. And then you leave and they turn it up, right? Or like, hey, your kids are being really noisy. Do you mind having them not like play tag at 11 p.m.? Like, I have to work in the morning and like we're apartment neighbors. And they're like, yeah, sure. And they close the door and then the kids are louder, right? That shows that they knew you were being bothered because you talked to them, and then they continued the behavior. And we want to see that pattern because we don't want somebody going to court and then being like, well, if I'd only known, I would have respected their wishes, but I didn't realize it was noisy. I didn't realize they were being bothered, right? So, and we don't have the hours of the time, but we do have a noise ordinance that covers amplified noise, right? And that could be from a vehicle or a car, and that covers like distance, and there's a decibel level as well tied to that. But really it's like, if I show up and I'm like so far away from the house, can I actually hear the noise or not, right? Most of the time for us with noise complaints, we're gonna use that disturbing the peace code. But we're still gonna show up and knock on your door and let you know. And I included this as something we use as an example because it's slightly different. We all respond very similarly, but kind of what happens next can be different depending on what our code is. But most often we are gonna still make contact. And oftentimes a lot of people who are newly resettled as refugees into Boise are living in high density housing. And let's be serious, like neighbors are nosy. You can hear everything that's going on in your neighbor's apartment, and most people don't wanna talk to their neighbors. So instead of knocking on your door, they're gonna call the cops and be like, hey, will you go tell them to keep it down? It doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily be in trouble, but we do need you to answer the door so we can talk with you, so we can at least advise you of what's going on, so we can prevent it from getting to the point of you being in trouble.
Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is battery and domestic battery. So we're going to kind of describe what that was, what that is, and what the Idaho State statute says those are. This is more of one of the higher priority calls that we go to, and it happens pretty often. It's typically a large percentage of our job, especially at nighttime. So what is battery? So according to the Idaho Code, battery is willful and unlawful use of force or violence upon the person of another. The caveat to that is also actual, intentional, and unlawful touching or striking of another person against the will of the other, and or unlawful intentionally causing bodily harm to an individual. So it seems pretty vague, but that can cover a lot of stuff. Most commonly when we think of battery, we think of people hitting, kicking each other. But what we commonly see also is people who spit on each other or throw stuff at each other. And that's also something else that's a big deal. So when does battery become domestic battery? So domestic battery is just a battery that occurs against a household member. So the state code 18918 defines a household member as a person who is a spouse, former spouse, or a person who has a child in common, regardless of whether they have been married or a person with whom a person is cohabitating, whether or not they have married or have held themselves out to be husband and wife. So it's kind of a long code. Sometimes when you go out on calls, people are confused about what battery is, what constitutes a domestic battery, and what constitutes a household member. So if it's somebody in your family who's your child or your aunt and uncle, that's not a household member. If it's an ex-wife that you have a child with, that's going to be considered a household member, okay? So that's how we determine the difference between the two. Also, the other thing that we deal with a lot is battery versus assault. In some states here, assault and battery used as the same thing. In the state of Idaho, they're different. Assault's going to be kind of the intent and the ability to commit the battery and the victim having a well-founded fear. But in assault, the battery doesn't actually occur. Once the battery occurs, that makes it the battery.
So our response to domestic battery calls. So just keep in mind, for domestic battery calls, those are some of the most dangerous calls for us to respond to, just because when you think of domestic relationships, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, partners, what have you, those emotions can run really high, and when people are super emotional, they do things that they wouldn't normally do. So our response to domestic calls may seem over the top for some people, but to us, it's again about safety. Safety for us and safety for whoever we're responding to. So with that in mind, when we respond to domestic calls, there will be more than one deputy or officer there. And then depending on what we're responding to, if there's one couple fighting, maybe we'll handle it with 2 or 3. If there's a couple and kids and friends and family and there's a party, there could be up to 10 cops at your place. Again, just for our safety. So, and we handle them all, across the board, we handle them all the same. So we're not gonna treat anybody differently. We're going to get there, we'll probably listen, see what's going on, if we can hear anything, and then we'll make contact with you, however that may be. If we have to knock on the door or if you're in the front yard, we'll announce ourselves, we'll make contact with you, and then we're going to want to separate everybody. This isn't us being mean, but we separate everyone so that we can get an accurate depiction of what happened. And we want everyone to be able to feel comfortable telling their side of the story of whatever occurred. If there's kids present, we'll even separate your children and talk to your children to ask them what happened or what they saw. Again, that's just so that they can feel comfortable talking without any sort of intimidation or anything like that. for domestic calls, depending on what's going on, dispatch will normally have medical people staged in case we need them. So if anyone's hurt or injured, we will give you medical attention. Paramedics will check you out. If you want to get transported, they'll transport you to the hospital. We're going to document everything. So each person gets interviewed, we'll document that. We'll take pictures if there was any sort of damage to the residents or anything like that. We're going to take pictures of that, and we'll document that in our report. We're going to take pictures of you. If whether you have or don't have injuries, we'll want pictures of your face, down, hands, all that, just so that we can document as much as possible for our reports. And then again, we just all want to get statements from everybody so that we can make impartial judgments. We're just going to be there to listen to whatever you guys are telling us, and then that will determine what we're going to do next. So what, like it says on the bottom here, what you say and how you say it is going to determine what we're going to do next.
So I think the biggest thing to keep in mind if you have police officers show up at your house is we're not trying to talk to you to get you in trouble. We're trying to talk to you to get a big picture of what has happened. I always tell people I get the trailer to the movie, right? So when I walk in, all I have is this little bit of information that dispatch has been given. And it's my job from there to do an investigation, an initial but a thorough investigation by talking to all involved parties to get as much information as I can to make sure that I appropriately take the next steps. So once we've spoken with everybody and we've come to a point where we've been able to identify a victim, a lot of our next steps are going to go kind of based off of either what our victim wants or also can depend on the severity of the crime. So for example, when we're talking about a domestic battery, or even like a strangulation, for example, if we have an incident where, a spouse is reporting the other spouse attempted to strangle them, that's a very serious crime, and we're going to take that seriously, and we have to take certain steps, right? Not to say that there's a typical battery, maybe like a fight at a bar, isn't a serious crime, but we have to have willing and involved parties, both like from the victims and individuals who are giving statements, right? So once we've completed our initial investigation, there's a couple different actions that we can take. There's verbal or written warnings. So when we think back to our noise complaints, right? Typically in the city of Meridian, if we haven't been to a house before, this is the first time that maybe your neighbor has thrown that party or played music too loud. A lot of times we want to try to resolve those issues at the lowest level possible. It doesn't mean we don't have to come back out in the future, but hopefully by spending some time talking with the occupants and educating them on either city code or ordinance or state statute, we can kind of come to that of, hey, here's your warning. This is your one opportunity to resolve the issue, and hopefully keep us from coming back, right? Understanding that verbal or written warnings, no further law enforcement action is going to be taken. So you're not going to hear back from police officers in the future. A detective isn't going to be assigned to your case. It's simply a warning. Just like if you were to get pulled over for speeding and the officer said, hey, slow down, here's your warning, right? The next step would be a citation. Again, we can think to our noise complaints, or maybe we even think about a bar fight where a battery occurred. Maybe we don't have the point to where we're going to effect an arrest, but the person will be cited. So typically this happens in a misdemeanor level crime where the suspect will get a citation with dates that they have to appear in court, okay? In those instances, a report typically is written along with that for the most part. And then we obviously have arrests. When I go back to what I was talking about, that it's strangulation or attempted strangulation, where we have a felony level crime, a very serious crime, an officer will effect an arrest. What that means is that the person will be taken into law enforcement's custody and they get transported to the Ada County Jail. And then depending on what the crime is, they can either bond out or sometimes they will have to remain in jail until they go to that first court hearing. We also have an option called, I think what we all call it is like a write-in route, but an easier way to explain that is it's where we take the police report, we actually have charges that are attached to that, and we complete our report with all of the statements of all involved parties, whether it's suspect, victim, witnesses, things like that, and then we route it to the prosecutor's office so they can review it. I think the biggest misconception from Hollywood is that we as police officers are the ones who are charging people. There actually has to be enough of the elements that are met for a charge to actually go through. So like I always tell people, hey, we are the information gatherers. My job is to gather as much information about what occurred during this incident, to document it, and then I forward it to the prosecutor's office for review, and then they determine if there's enough to move forward with charges. And I'm sure they'll talk about that in a little bit. And then our last option is an information-only report. A lot of times this happens in instances where maybe we don't have a willing victim, and that doesn't mean that the victim's not willing. Maybe they're intimidated by the suspect. Maybe they're feeling coerced not to say anything by the suspect before law enforcement arrived, and maybe the neighbor's the one who called, and then you hear the knock at the door, and the suspect turns to the victim and says, if you say anything, this is gonna happen, right? So we all have been in those instances where maybe they're not willing right now, but maybe in 6 months or a week, they're gonna get enough courage that says, you know what, enough is enough, I'm done, I wanna pursue charges. In those instances, if we don't have enough to make the arrest, to issue a citation, or maybe even enough to forward it off to the prosecutor's office, we can still document that in a police report, but what we'll do is we keep it essentially on file in the police department. So if the person comes back in 24 hours or 5 days later and says, hey, I do actually want to pursue charges, we have that already documented. We don't have to go back and try to remember what happened when we responded to that incident. And then what happens after we leave? So think about all those options I just gave you, and I know it's a lot of information in a very short amount of time, but I think the biggest question we have is, hey, what happened with my case? And it's important for you guys to know what happens next, right? I think that's a big reason why we're all sitting in this room, is trying to figure out how to navigate the criminal justice system. So I think it's important first for people to understand that depending on what happens in our initial investigation, and we can think about this, I think the best example might be like a fraud report. Your debit card gets, I can't think of the word, hacked, like your debit card number gets used and you are not the one who used it, right? Depending on if we have a lead or not as to who we think the suspect might be, depending on the information we have, there may not be any more action we as law enforcement can take. Whereas if we have leads, if we have an idea of who the suspect may be, maybe we responded and the suspect was already gone. So initial more follow-up needs to be conducted. Or maybe it's a felony level case where more information needs to be gathered. I can think of that specifically in like sexual assault reports. Typically your patrol officer is gonna come out, they'll take the initial report, but the follow-up is going to be done by a detective or an investigator. And so understanding that you may or may not hear back from officers depending on what your report entails. However, if you have questions related to where is my investigation, where is my case, what is going on, typically, I know in the city of Meridian, so I can't speak for everybody standing on the stage, but our officers will give you a business card with their name and your case number on it. In those instances, if you have questions related to what is your investigation status, I typically recommend reach out to that officer. The email is on there. You can email them. The other side of it is you can also give them a phone call to Ada County Dispatch non-emergency number and just request to speak with an officer. As far as the case status, was the suspect charged? In those instances where we have written a report and routed it to the prosecutor's office, if you're looking for statuses of the charging status, I guess, for lack of a better term, the prosecutor's office is who you are going to want to reach out to, and I'm sure when they're standing up here today, they'll be able to give you that information. And then last but not least, adding supplemental information to your report. If you think of something after we leave, that's fine. We can add it to a police report. It's not a big deal. In those instances, what you'll want to do is, again, reach out to that officer who took the initial report and let them know, hey, I have some more information that I thought of that I want to make sure is documented.
All right, officer accountability. So it's actually really important to all of our police departments to not only hear when we're doing things really well. We actually love kudos. We love to hear that, because often a lot of our officers are out in patrol and they're operating they're not being supervised directly. There's not somebody over their shoulder seeing what they're doing. There's not somebody leaning over a cubicle watching what they're doing. So when they do things really well, often the only person who knows is you. But if you don't share that information with us, we can't give them positive feedback like that. And sometimes what you think was amazing to them was just another call and how they do things all the time. And that positive feedback really helps our officers continue doing a good job servicing our community. But also, tell us when we do things poorly. Even if it's just your perspective and the officer didn't do anything wrong, we want to know. Because we can't fix problems we don't know we have, and we can't adjust that officer's behavior or our training or how we do things if we're not understanding and we're not getting that feedback from our community on how we're being perceived. Because I hear things sometimes and people tell me things and I'm like, well, you need to let us know that, right? You need to give us that feedback when those things are happening, because sometimes you might not like what happened in that call with that officer, and you can call dispatch, non-emergency directly, and talk to their supervisor. And I've seen these happen all the time where once the supervisor actually explained the whole situation, people were no longer upset. There was just big pieces of misunderstanding that were part of that contact, but now we were able to clear it up because now they were able to talk with somebody who had explained the whole situation. In my position, I've had people come to me sometimes long after the incident and the interaction with officers, and they had a lot of fear from that interaction. And I was able to sit down with them. I was able to look at the call, talk to the officer, and then sit down with them and explain some things. And then we're able to get rid of that fear because now they understand what actually happened and why it happened. I'm able to, when they feel like they were discriminated against, if there's an actual instance where officers are doing that, I'll help hold your hand through that process. And almost any of our officers will, because we want officers to be held accountable for bad behavior just as much as the general public does, because that reflects poorly on all of us. And we don't condone that behavior. But often is the case is that was the perspective of that person because they don't know what's normal. Hey, the officers did this. I was pulled over on a traffic stop and the officers did that. And I'm like, that's really normal. We do that to everybody. And they're like, oh. It's not just because, fill in the blank about whatever makes you different. So I had one of these from like our babysitter last week. She texted me, she goes, hey, so if you're pulled over, is it normal for an officer to ask for your phone number? And I'm like, yeah, because they're gonna write it on your citation. She's like, oh, okay. And they were really upset. They were a bunch of like 17 and 18-year-old girls who'd gotten pulled over, and they were like, the officers can't do that and they can't do this. And so we were able to talk about it. But what if they hadn't known an officer to text or call? Now they're carrying that with them and into their next interaction with law enforcement about how they felt like poorly treated or maybe we did something we weren't supposed to do. It's really important both for our community members and for our officers to know when you feel like we're not doing our jobs well, but also when we are doing it well. We want to do more of the things you like, and we want to clear things up as much as we can when there is some kind of either miscommunication or misunderstanding. But most importantly, when we need to take disciplinary action or we need to change our training or our approach to our community, we don't know that if you don't give us feedback. So we want to handle those things. Because like I said, I don't want, if Deputy Levis goes all like AWOL and starts acting like a jerk to everybody, there's people who think we're the same person if we're wearing a bun because we both have brown hair. Do we look a lot alike? Nope. But if we're both in a uniform and we have our hair in a bun, all of a sudden we are the same person. I've had people tell me about traffic stops where I pulled them over 15 years ago and I've only been a cop for 8 years. And then I was like, oh, she had brown hair and it was in a bun, right? So we understand that people view us all this as the same person and very interchangeable. So I don't want somebody going AWOL and making us look bad, but if I don't know about it, we can't fix it. So we really appreciate feedback from our communities, and there's lots of different ways that you can do that. You can call dispatch directly, talk to that supervisor. You can send emails to our department, and those will all get written up, and you can say how amazing it was. I've had things sent directly to me. You can send it directly to an officer, and trust me, especially if it's kudos, we're gonna make sure everybody knows about that. Right? So, and we're gonna make sure those officers get that information back to them so they can be like, you know what, the community really liked that, I'm gonna do more of it. Because we like the support that we get in Ada County and in Idaho. We really appreciate the support from our community, and we want to make sure that we're doing things well. All right, time for some questions. And then I'm gonna check in. So if you're on with us virtually as well, make sure you type any questions in the chat and we'll try and get to those. So if you guys have some questions for us, please.
I guess I'm just curious, what's the type of training that your deputies or officers receive for crisis situations, de-escalation, those kinds of things?
You're asking the crisis intervention team officer. No, so that's a really good question. Specifically when it comes to mental health, and I can speak more so for Meridian, but I know my counterparts at my local agencies, because we all have CIT teams. I know the goal is for 100% of our officers to go through the CIT 40 class. So during that class, they actually have the opportunity not only to learn from individuals who are suffering from mental illness and get the professional training from mental health providers, but there's also things like verbal de-escalation and things like that that are tied into that. They also get it in our patrol academy. So as they're going through in the academy, that's another topic that's covered. It's actually, we as Meridian Police Department are going through block training right now, and it's a 4-hour block that we covered again, just because we recognize that that's very important. I mean, my whole job is responding to mental health calls for service throughout the day, and I use verbal de-escalation all of the time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it's the same for Boise. We do the same kind of training in our academy. We do refresher trainings. But honestly, when people talk to me about becoming a cop, how good are you at talking to people? That's the skill we use the most. And honestly, it's something that we use that really accents our officer safety. We know it enhances our ability to keep ourselves and our community safe. So a lot of our officers are actually really good at that, and it's something that we're using all day, every day. So that CIT 40 class is a 40-hour class that everyone in our department's gone through, but it's very heavily attended by everybody in our valley. All of our agencies, most of their officers have attended that class. And honestly, after going through it again, several years of becoming an officer, there's a lot of information that I'm like, I already know all this stuff, because we actually deal with people in mental health crisis and a lot of situations so often that a lot of that information is just a review. After you've been an officer for 2 years, you actually understand a lot of that. Some really important parts of that class are actually recognizing stakeholders and ways to address and resolve those problems without involving us. And that's a big part of that training as well. But verbal de-escalation, all those things are layered in there as well, besides just mental health things.
Can I add something? Yep. Sorry. So just something I want to add, because I don't think everyone in this room is aware, but BPD, Ada County, and Meridian all have crisis intervention teams. Boise actually calls it the Behavioral Health Response Team, and our whole goal is, or not goal, but we actually co-respond out with a mental health clinician. So we're not just talking about law enforcement anymore, and I would say Meridian is in the process, our clinician just finished backgrounds yesterday, so he will be starting here this next month. But when we go out to a call for service related to a mental health crisis, you're not just getting law enforcement on scene, you're also getting a mental health professional on scene to help with that issue.
I'm sorry, I guess I'll just give you the feedback so you can have it right now. I'm a designated examiner, and so I think I've written hold applications written by you, and then also Officer Slater, so very familiar. So that's really helpful for us when they are written accurately, and so we can understand the symptomology and what's happening as to why they were placed on the hold. So I thought I would just mention that for you.
Do you guys want to add something about your agency specifically?
No, excuse me. So at Garden City, we don't have a specific team that deals with mental health crisis. But what we do is we collaborate, of course, with Meridian and a lot with Boise. And we know the issues that are happening around the community, and we work a lot with our resources. We work with ALS 81, which is kind of an on-call source that we can use, medical source that we can use to help problem solve and decide what we can do to best help somebody. We use a lot of the outside resources, such as Pathways. That's a good place we try to help people get to, and we do the best we can with getting people the best help.
So for Ada County, we have a specific CIT team as well. We have Deputy Hellbach, Deputy Clough, and then Tara Curry is, I believe she's a social worker, and she rides out with our CIT deputies, and they're on every day. So when they're not available, we have the same training as these guys do. I've taken that 40-hour CIT class, and the verbal de-escalation and all that stuff. So it mirrors what these guys have already said.
So this might be a question for the court's presentation, but if I had a student, I again work at a school that serves a lot of people that don't have English as their first language, and they come in with a paper that says you have a court date at this time, and they're like looking at me, showing me the paper, not be able to communicate to me, what would you suggest that I do in that circumstance?
That's definitely, I would hold that for the court.
Okay.
Because they'll be able to answer that better.
Got it.
That's a good question, thank you.
So when you guys separate families, when you said you had like a domestic, and how do you deal with it when it's a family that doesn't speak English at all? Like, do you have enough officers, enough people there on your team that can speak with the children, speak with the one spouse and the other spouse?
I would say most of the time, yes. So depending on the severity of the call is going to depend on how many deputies or officers are going to arrive. So at any given time, there could be 10 deputies ready to go on one call. And as far as interpretation goes, if we need somebody to interpret, then we will separate and hang out with the kids or the wife or the husband or what have you. And then that one deputy is going to want to go through and interview everybody, which is normally the case. If there's a lead deputy, they'll want to be the ones interviewing, and then the rest of us are just there for the separation and the safety. Does that make sense? Do you guys have anything to add?
Another silly question. Have you guys ever, when you talk about noise complaints, have you ever had it to the point where the person calling is making false accusations with the noise, and it's not, there really isn't really a noise? Because I'm just thinking to my college days.
I can't specifically think of anything like that that's happened, but I'm sure I've gone to noise complaints where I've gotten there and there's absolutely no noise. And so I'll just call the person back and say, hey, I drove out there. I didn't hear anything. And that's going to solve the problem. But if they continually call, then we'll have to handle it another way.
Yes. Yes. So being from Boise, we have a lot more apartment complexes and things like that. I have seen cases where it might appear that maybe they're not being completely truthful, and maybe people are using it as retaliation or ways to punish neighbors. Sometimes there's at least a kernel of truth to that. So the best thing you can do if you feel like you're being, like, have somebody accusing you of noise complaints that aren't true is actually talk to the officers. And they'll give you advice on how you can protect yourself in that situation as well. But especially if there's a property manager involved, it's always good to involve them as well. And sometimes people are like, well, I don't want to call and I don't want to rock the boat. But it's easy to be railroaded by somebody who really wants you out of there. And I've seen situations where definitely a neighbor just decided they did not like this neighbor, and then they call on every little thing. Well, if they're complaining and then that person isn't talking to the property manager and they're not communicating with the officers, like, if we only get one side of the story, that's what we have to go on, right? So we will see if we actually observe noise and those kind of things, but often because it's a low priority call, it's kind of fixed itself by the time we arrive. But if that person is really adamant they want to pursue charges, we've kind of have to do something, right? And then that has to go to the court and it has to go through there. But really the best thing that person can do if they're being accused of they feel like is false accusations is actually speak with the officer and communicate with them so we can figure out what's actually going on, and we can give both people some advice to hopefully resolve that situation and keep us out of it too. So that was a good question. I know there was one more here. We have one more online. Okay. So let's do online, and then we will not forget you, I promise.
So Drew, who's online, says, if a client is struggling with mental health symptoms such as psychosis and are not stable enough to get themselves to the hospital, and we as behavioral health providers are not able to transport the clients to the hospital, what is your best advice for how to handle that, especially with clients who are nervous about law enforcement involvement? They're wanting to know, do we utilize mobile crisis for support or CIT team? How should we handle that?
That's a really good question. And the answer is kind of all of that. So I know mobile crisis is sitting in back, so not to point you out, but we commonly co-respond to calls. I know there's times where MCU, and I don't want to speak necessarily on behalf of them, but I know they've gone out and they've helped assist with getting a client or family member to the hospital without law enforcement's involvement. But sometimes there's instances, especially when someone who is really sick, that law enforcement does need to get involved simply to maintain the safety, not only of family members or friends or the providers, but also for the safety of that person, like that own client's safety, right? So in those instances, I think the biggest thing is if you call dispatch and you feel like it's at the point where law enforcement needs to be involved, understand you can ask for the CIT team to respond if we're available. You can also reach out to Mobile Crisis. They know how to directly get in contact with all of the CIT teams in law enforcement. And then you'll also have my email at the end of this, I believe, or it's in handouts. So you also have my email. You're welcome to reach out to me, and I'm happy to give you my cell phone number, and you can call me anytime, and I can help respond.
Yeah, and I know, Boise, we do a lot of voluntary transports, like for a voluntary hold. So you're not in trouble, but we are going to handcuff you, and we'll explain why. But we'll put you in the back of our car, and we'll give you a ride, and then we'll take the handcuffs off, and it's all good. So we do, like, that is something that we will do to help facilitate that, because we'd rather just help give you a ride if that's what you need to do is get to the hospital, than respond out when things have escalated and spiraled like beyond that point, and then we have to take action. So that is something that we can do as well. And I know we had one last question.
Yes, I wanted to ask, I guess, the messaging that you might want towards the undocumented community that are maybe afraid of reaching out to law enforcement because they're afraid of being reported to ICE.
Okay, so I'll just go off my experience. When we respond out to community, that's not our goal. That's not on our mind. That's not something we're thinking about. That's a higher level of law enforcement that we're not dealing with at that time. We suggest if there's a problem, they'll call us and we'll come out and help. We're there to help whatever situation is going on, whether it's a domestic, whether it's a battery, whether it's a threat situation. We're not dealing with that. We just really want to make sure that we can respond out to you and not have you be concerned about deportation or anything like that.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, like, that's something that we're not going to be reporting to federal agencies about that. The only time we probably will communicate is we have a suspect who's committing like violent, dangerous crimes. We'll probably report that to those agencies. Like, hey, did you know this person? I'm not sure of their citizenship status. Maybe this is another avenue we can go to solve this problem and keep people safe. But other than that, we're not reporting people's citizenship status to other federal agencies. It's an often misconception, and it creates a lot of fear and an unwillingness to like have their voice be heard when they're a victim of a crime. But that's not something that we're worried about. Now, is there we are going to ask for your name and your date of birth and all of your personal information, because we need to be able to positively identify you to have you be in a police report. We can't just say, like, we don't know who this person is. If we need to be able to contact you, we need to be able to say who you are, because there is due process on both sides, right? So, but that's not our goal as law enforcement. A lot of the officers in the Valley are going to ask people if they came as a refugee and how long they've been in the U.S., but it has nothing to do with your citizenship status. It's something that I'm training them to do because it helps me, when they call me for help, know what resources are available for that person. And that's the pure reason that I have my officers asking those questions, because it helps speed things along for us, really helping getting to the root cause of issues so the police aren't involved.
Okay. Is this the same for Canyon County? Are you aware?
I cannot speak to Canyon County.
Okay.
And I definitely think their demographics are a little different. So that would be something that I would ask those departments directly. They may have different relationships with the federal agencies than we do. But I would say most often, most police departments aren't directly just reporting every time they deal with somebody who they think doesn't have citizenship.
So I will say, when that comes into a bigger play is if we have a suspect that ends up going to jail. That information is going to come up. But as far as on the street, out in the community, that information doesn't come up.